Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this video we are going to be working towards creating the database service for our application, which is going to allow us to actually communicate with the Firestore database and actually retrieve or save data into the database. So without anything further to do, let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is that inside of my services folder, I'm going to create a new file and call this database service, so dbservice.dar. Once I have that, inside of this, I'm going to import our Cloud Firestore package. And after that, I'm going to create the actual class for our database service. So once we have the class defined, the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create the static member variable for our class, which is going to allow us to actually access our DB service class, and then I'll assign it equal to an instance of our DB service. I'm going to then create the actual constructor for our class, and I'll for now leave it empty. The next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a new function, which is going to be responsible for actually saving our user to the Firestore database, and I'll call this function create user in DB, so just in DB, and then I'm going to actually define what's going to get into the function. But before we actually save data to the database, or actually write about stuff that we want to save to the database, what I would like to bring to your attention is the things that we require, or the data we need to actually perform this write request. So the data we would require is going to be firstly the user ID. So I'm just going to call it user ID. That's going to be passed into this function. We'll also require the name of our user. We'll also require the email for our user. And then finally, we would require the image URL. So I'll just call it image URL. And then after that, we are actually ready to actually create all of the logic inside of this function. So I'm just going to do command save. And then what we can do is that we can now start typing in some code for actually doing a transaction on the Firestore database. So all I'm going to do is that I am going to access the Firestore instance first. And the way we're going to access it is that I'm going to define on top of our class a Firestore DB variable, and then this variable is going to have access to our Firestore database. So then whenever our database service is created, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to set our database to our Firestore.instance. So once we have access to our Firestore database, the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to define the name of our user collection. And the way I like to do this, that I would like to set a string, which I'll call _user collection. And I'll set that equal to the actual collection that we have for users, which is users inside of Firebase. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do _db.collection, and then the collection would be our user collection. So inside of our database, we'll go to our users collection. And after that, here we are going to create a document, and the document that we're going to create is going to have the ID, and we are not going to leave this empty, because if we leave this empty, then it will generate a auto ID. But we want the ID to be the ID that gets passed in, or the user's ID. And then after that, we are going to use the setData method, and the setData method actually expects a map inside of it, which is going to be the data that is actually going to be saved inside of Firebase. So if I just open up the Firestore database inside of our Firebase project and actually show you how the actual database looks at a quick glance, just to kind of give you a sense of what we're going to save. So this is our Firestore database, and then we'll have a document which will be the user's ID for the document ID, and then we'll have these 4 things saved for the user. To save these 4 things, all we have to do is that we would have to, inside of our map, create these 4 entries. So the first one is going to be name, and the name is going to be equal to the name that gets passed into this function. Then we'll have the email for the user, and the email will be the email that gets passed in. After that, we'll have the image for the user, so image would be the image URL that gets passed in, and then finally the last thing would be the last seen attribute, and this would be equal to a datetime dot now dot utc or to UDC. And the reason we're doing this is because when we create a user in the database, then obviously that's the first time the user logged in. So we'll just set last seen to date time to whatever the current timestamp is, and then convert it to UTC. So once that is done, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to do this and do command save. But what I would like to do is that I would like to actually await for this function to complete, and to actually use this await keyword inside of our function, we have to mark our function as an async function. And then with that, what we can do is that we can await for the user to actually get created, and then we can also return this. And with this, we should be good. Okay, so we're now returning the actual transaction that we do on the database, and we actually set the data for our user. But if we use this function and actually try to set the data for an already existing document, this function would crash. And the way we're going to fix this is that I'm going to actually use a try catch block. So inside of our function, I'm going to use a try catch block, and then I'm going to put this function code block inside of our try statement. So we are going to try to run this transaction, and if for any case this transaction fails, then we're going to catch the exception, and then we're going to print that exception to the console. And then I'm going to do command save. So with this, we have a function that is going to create the user for us inside of the database. So how do we now test that this actually works and that our database service actually creates a user for us? Well, an easy way to test this would be that we can go to our main.dart file. And then inside of our main.dart file, I'm just going to import our service. So I'm just going to do ./services/db service. And once we have our db service inside of our main build method, I'm just going to do db service.instance.create user in database. And then here we'll just pass in some dummy data. So for the name, I'll just call the name as James. The email, I'll just call it james@gmail.com. This is just dummy data that I'm just putting in to actually show you that this transaction does update some data or upload some data in the database. For the image URL, I'll just say http://www.pravatar.cc, and that's pretty much it. And then for the UID, I'll just call 0123 and do Alt-Shift-F. And then I'm not going to do command save, because if I do command save, then this transaction is going to run. Before that, I'm going to bring over the Firebase console. And for now, we have nothing inside of our user collection, instead only for the actual user that we manually created. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to do command save. This should hot reload the app, and we should perform this transaction on the database. And now if I go back to our database, we're going to see that the document was created with that ID of 0123, and then all of the attributes for this document were set, which were the email, image, last seen, and name. So now I'm going to do is just delete this document, and then I am going to remove this line of code, and finally just remove the import statement for our database service. So with that, we have successfully implemented the database service inside of our application. We now have the ability to actually talk to the Firestore database, actually store some data regarding a user inside of the database. And now in the next video, what we're going to do is actually work towards the storage service, which is going, or the cloud storage service that Firebase provides us to actually save some files onto the Firestore, which are going to be the user's profile pictures and the actual image chat messages that we send. So with that, I'm going to end this video here, and in the next so with that, we have successfully implemented the database service inside of our application, and we now have a function that is able to actually communicate with Firebase and actually store some data inside of Firestore regarding a particular user. So with that, I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to see you guys in the next one.